What happens when a Hollywood icon walks into a studio expecting a calm conversation and walks out into a storm of judgment, tension, and unanswered questions? Before this story unfolds any further, make sure you subscribe to Stage Leaks, hit the like button, and drop a comment if you love deep, emotional, behind-the-scenes celebrity stories like this. Your support keeps these explosive moments coming. The red on-air light blinked to life. The familiar theme music of The View faded into applause, rolling through the studio like distant thunder. The audience smiled, clapped, and leaned forward in their seats, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history. Johnny Depp sat backstage, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The makeup artist's brush hovered near his cheek, but his eyes were far away, somewhere between memory and regret, somewhere between exhaustion and quiet defiance. His hair was tied back loosely. His rings caught the light. His signature scarf rested around his neck like emotional armor. He had done hundreds of interviews. Late-night shows, press tour, award ceremonies, courtrooms. But today felt different. There was a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. A whisper in his mind that said, "Be careful." His publicist leaned in gently. 5 minutes, Johnny. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm ready. But was he? Across the hallway, in the brightly lit studio, Sunny Hostin adjusted her notes. Her face was calm, professional, controlled. But behind that composure was preparation sharpened like a blade. She had read everything. Every article, every transcript, every headline, every controversy. She wasn't there to flatter. She was there to question. And she intended to be direct. Very direct. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair, sipping coffee, watching the monitors. Joy Behar whispered something to Sarah Haynes. The producers exchanged nervous glances. They knew. Today's interview wasn't going to be light. No funny stories, no movie clips and smiles, no easy laughs. This was going to be emotional. And possibly explosive. A stage manager raised a hand. 30 seconds. The audience clapped louder as Johnny Depp stepped onto the set. He walked slowly, gracefully, like a man who had learned how to move under pressure. The applause grew. Some fans whistled. Some stood up. Johnny smiled politely. Not big, not fake. Just enough. He waved once, then took his seat. For a brief moment, everything looked perfect. The lighting, the cameras, the smiles. A famous actor, a popular talk show, a calm beginning. Whoopi leaned forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Johnny Depp. More applause. Johnny nodded. Thank you, thank you. His voice was soft, almost fragile. Whoopi smiled warmly. Johnny, it's good to see you. Good to be here, he replied. Sunny glanced down at her notes. Joy tilted her head. Sarah folded her hands. The conversation started gently. They talked about his latest project, his love for music, his journey through art. Johnny relaxed slightly. His shoulders dropped. He even laughed once. For a moment, he thought, maybe this won't be so bad. But storms never announce themselves. They just arrive. Sunny lifted her head. Her eyes met his. And everything changed. Johnny, she said calmly, you've been through years of public controversy. The audience grew quieter. Johnny nodded. Yes, I have. Sunny continued. Court cases, accusations, media storms, public opinion shifting back and forth. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. How do you respond to people who say that despite the verdicts, they still believe you hurt someone? Silence. Not complete silence, but the kind that feels heavy. Like the air itself has stopped moving. Johnny blinked. Once. Twice. He wasn't expecting it so soon. Not this directly. Not this sharp. He adjusted his ring slowly. Well, he began, I think people are entitled to their opinions. Sonny didn't look away. But do you understand why some victims feel unheard when powerful men walk away with their careers intact? A murmur rippled through the audience. Johnny's jaw tightened. His eyes darkened slightly. I never walked away, he said quietly. I fought for my truth. Sonny raised an eyebrow. But others say you fought to protect your image, not justice. Whoopi shifted in her chair. Joy frowned slightly. Sarah glanced between them. Johnny leaned back. Took a breath. I lost everything, he replied. Movies, friends, reputation, years of my life. Sonny nodded. Yet you're still here, on national TV, promoting projects making millions. Johnny's fingers curled. I earned this, he said, through pain. The tension was now visible, like invisible wires stretching between them. Sonny leaned forward. Do you take any responsibility for the toxic dynamic in that relationship? Johnny froze. For half a second, it felt like time cracked open. His mind flooded with memories. Courtrooms, recordings, headlines, people shouting his name, people hatting his name. I take responsibility for my flaws, he said slowly, like any human being. Sonny pressed, but not for emotional harm. A gasp came from somewhere in the audience. Johnny's voice lowered. I never intended harm. But intent doesn't erase impact, Sonny replied. Now Whoopi raised her hand slightly. Let's. But Johnny spoke first. No, he said, let her ask. Everyone looked at him. His eyes were shining now. Not with anger. With something deeper. Exhaustion. Pain. Defiance. Sonny softened her tone slightly. Johnny, people watching want honesty, not performance. That word. Performance. It hit him. Like a slap. His lips parted. Do you think this is a performance? He asked. Sonny hesitated. I think celebrities learn how to control narratives. Johnny leaned forward. His voice trembled. You think I wanted to bleed in public? The audience was dead silent. You think I enjoyed having my life dissected? Sonny responded calmly. I think accountability matters. Johnny shook his head. His smile was gone. I was accountable, in court, in life, in pain. A producer whispered urgently into a headset. Cameras zoomed slightly closer. Every twitch, every breath, every emotion. Captured. Immortalized. Sonny looked at him steadily. Some survivors watching feel dismissed when you frame yourself only as a victim. Johnny's hands dropped to his knees. He stared at the floor, then looked up, and something in his eyes had changed. This isn't fair, he said quietly. Sonny replied, life isn't fair. That was it. That sentence. Simple. Cold. Unforgiving. Johnny stood. The audience gasped. Whoopi stood halfway. Johnny. He shook his head. No, I can't do this. Sonny looked shocked. Wait. I came here to talk about healing, he said, voice breaking, not to be judged again. Producers rushed. Cameras scrambled. Johnny grabbed his jacket. I've lived this nightmare already. He turned. Walked away. The applause didn't come. Only whispers. Only stunned faces. Only disbelief. As he disappeared backstage, the red ON air light kept glowing. Still recording. Still watching. Still waiting. And outside that studio, on phones and screens across the world, a storm was about to explode. What made the moment so unforgettable wasn't just what Dave Chappelle said. It was what happened after. Because once that first sharp exchange landed, Once the audience fell into that strange, uncomfortable silence, everyone on that stage realized the interview was no longer following the script. And that is exactly when live television becomes dangerous. For the producers, dangerous means unpredictable. For the audience, dangerous means unforgettable. And for someone like Dave Chappelle, dangerous is where he does his best work. The cameras were still rolling. The lights were still hot. The hosts were still sitting there, trying to maintain the polished rhythm that The View is known for. But the energy in the room had changed in a way that could not be edited out, not in real time, not in the moment, and certainly not in the minds of the people watching. Joy Behar tried to recover first. That's what seasoned hosts do. They regain control. They reframe. They soften. They pivot. But the problem with a pivot is that it only works when the room is willing to move with you. This room was. She let out a short laugh, one of those careful, strategic laughs designed to release pressure without admitting discomfort. Then she leaned forward and said something that sounded calm on the surface, but carried a clear challenge underneath. She said Dave was making it sound like asking serious questions was somehow unfair. And there it was again. Not just a question, a setup, a framing device, a way of placing him in the position of having to defend not just his comedy, but his character. Dave noticed it instantly. He always does. He tilted his head slightly, almost amused, almost disappointed, and gave that look only he can give, the look of someone who has already seen the trap, stepped around it, and is now deciding whether to point it out. Then he spoke. He said the problem isn't serious questions. The problem is selective seriousness. That line hit harder than most people realized in the moment. Because suddenly, he wasn't just responding to Joy. He was indicting the entire culture of televised debate. He was suggesting that outrage, especially on mainstream talk shows, is often applied inconsistently, loudly when it's fashionable, softly when it's inconvenient, and not at all when it threatens the wrong people. A few members of the audience clapped instinctively. Others hesitated. Some looked around, trying to read the room before reacting. And that hesitation, that uncertainty, that is exactly what makes these moments go viral. People don't go viral because everyone agrees. They go viral because nobody can look away. Sunny Hostin stepped in next, clearly sensing that Joy was now in a direct one-on-one standoff and that the panel needed reinforcement. Her tone was more measured, more legal, more polished. She framed the issue around responsibility, public influence, cultural impact, the way words can shape attitudes whether the speaker intends it or not. It was a strong argument. Maybe the strongest one on the table. And for a moment, it looked like the conversation might finally settle into a serious, structured debate. But Dave didn't flinch. He nodded respectfully. Then he did something that completely changed the mood again. He agreed, partially. And partial agreement, when used by someone like Chappelle, can be more devastating than a direct denial. He said yes, public figures do have influence. Yes, words matter. Yes, comedians should know their reach. But then he added that the same standard should apply to media personalities, panel shows, political commentators, and everyone else who turns conflict into content. That landed like a direct hit. Because now, he wasn't only defending himself. He was widening the frame. He was asking a question no one on that stage seemed prepared to answer. If comedians are held responsible for what people might feel after a joke, then what responsibility do media figures carry for what people feel after a public takedown? The audience reacted with a louder murmur this time. You could hear it. Not full applause. Not laughter. Something in between. That low, electric sound a crowd makes when they know a line just cut deeper than expected. Whoopi looked toward Dave, then toward the audience, then back to the table. She knew exactly what was happening. She had been in enough heated conversations, on camera and off, to recognize when a guest had stopped being defensive and started becoming dangerous in the rhetorical sense. Because once someone starts exposing the rules of the room while still inside the room loses power. And Dave knew that. He wasn't just answering questions anymore. He was pulling the curtain back. He was making the audience see the machinery. The segment was supposed to be about his comedy, his controversies, his words. But now, the viewers were watching the hosts themselves. Watching their expressions. Watching who interrupted. Watching who leaned in. Watching who went silent. Watching who smiled when they were uncomfortable. And on live TV, that shift is everything. Joy tried again, this time sharper. She said something to the effect of, "So now everyone else is the problem." It was the kind of line designed to corner him into sounding evasive. But Dave didn't take the bait. He smiled. A small one. The kind that tells you the next sentence is going to sting. He said, "No, everyone isn't the problem. The problem is pretending there's only one kind of power in America." That line froze the room again. Because now he had moved beyond comedy, beyond controversy, beyond daytime TV. Now he was talking about culture itself. He was suggesting that the spotlight isn't the only form of influence, that a microphone behind a desk can be just as powerful as a microphone on a stage, that people who judge the message often refuse to examine the system delivering the judgment. And in that moment, something shifted in the audience. You could feel it. Some people weren't just watching a celebrity defend himself anymore. They were watching a man challenge the moral hierarchy of television, live, calmly, and with surgical precision. That's when Joy's tone changed. Not louder. Colder. She reminded him that people are hurt by language. That intent doesn't erase impact. That saying, "I'm a comedian," doesn't magically remove consequences. And again, on paper, that's a strong point. A very strong point. But Dave's response is what made the clash unforgettable. He said consequences are real. But selective outrage is also real. He said some people want artists to be honest, but only if that honesty arrives wrapped in the exact politics they approve of. And when it doesn't, they don't challenge the art. They try to disqualify the artist. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. It was one of those rare television moments where the silence isn't awkward anymore. It's heavy, intentional, charged. And then, almost unbelievably, Dave leaned back and got quieter. That's what made it powerful. He didn't escalate. He lowered the temperature. And by lowering the temperature, he raised the tension. He said that the most revealing thing about modern media is not what people are allowed to say. It's what kinds of questions are considered brave and which ones are considered unacceptable. Now the audience broke again. This time with a louder burst of applause. Not everyone, but enough to make it impossible to ignore. You could see Joy absorb it. That had to sting. Because applause on a show like The View matters. It changes momentum. It validates energy. It can turn a host's challenge into a guest's victory in real time. And Dave, whether intentionally or instinctively, had turned the crowd into a second panel. A panel that was beginning to side with him. Sunny tried to steer it back toward specifics. She referenced the actual criticisms around his specials, the public backlash, the headlines, the reactions from activists and commentators. And for the first time in several minutes, Dave paused longer than usual. Not because he was lost, because he was choosing the strike carefully. Then he said something that, if it had really happened exactly this way, would have become the clip everyone reposted. He said headlines are often written by people who never stay long enough for the full conversation. And then he looked around the table and added, "Sometimes they sit at the table." That line detonated. Gasps. A few shocked laughs. A sudden burst of applause. One host leaned back like she physically felt the impact of it. Whoopi covered her mouth for half a second, not because she was offended, but because she knew. She knew the room had just crossed into one of those rare live moments where no producer, no commercial break, and no polished outro could fully restore control. At that point, the interview was no longer just tense. It was legendary. Because whether viewers loved him or hated him, they were now seeing something almost never seen on daytime television. A guest refusing the frame. A guest refusing the guilt posture. A guest refusing to play the role he had been invited to play. And instead, Dave Chappelle was doing what only the most dangerous guests can do. He was rewriting the scene while everyone else was still in it. By now, the segment had become something no one on that stage could fully control. Not the hosts. Not the producers. Not even the audience. Because once a live conversation crosses a certain line, once it stops being an interview and starts becoming a confrontation, it takes on a life of its own. And that is exactly what was happening. The studio no longer felt like a daytime talk show. It felt like a pressured chamber. Every glance mattered. Every pause mattered. Every breath between sentences suddenly carried more weight than the words themselves. The hosts were still smiling when they needed to smile, still nodding when they needed to nod, still performing the rhythms of television. But underneath that polished exterior, you could feel the strain. The control was slipping. And on a show built around managing emotion, that kind of slippage is impossible to hide. Dave Chappelle, on the other hand, looked almost more comfortable now than he had at the beginning. That's what made him so dangerous in that moment. Most guests shrink when the pressure rises. Dave sharpened. He didn't look rattled. He looked awake, fully locked in. As if the first 10 minutes of polite questions had just been the warm-up, and now the real conversation had finally begun. Joy Behar tried once more to reclaim authority, not with outrage, but with something even more effective on television: certainty. She leaned forward, lowered her voice slightly, and made the kind of statement meant to sound definitive. She said the issue wasn't whether Dave was funny. The issue was whether someone with his reach understood that jokes don't exist in a vacuum. That line was designed to reset the conversation, to pull it away from media criticism, away from the hosts, away from the show itself, and back onto him, back onto his material, back onto his accountability. It was a smart move. Maybe the smartest move of the entire segment. Because if she could keep the focus there, she could reestablish the panel's moral high ground. But Dave saw it immediately. And instead of resisting the question, he walked straight into it. He said, of course, jokes don't exist in a vacuum. Neither do headlines. Neither do sound bites. Neither do outrage segments. And neither does a panel of powerful people deciding, in real time, how a national audience is supposed to interpret someone's intent. That was the moment the air changed again. Not because it was louder. Because it was cleaner. Sharper. More dangerous. He wasn't just defending his comedy anymore. He was numbing the mechanism. He was exposing how narratives are built, how a joke can be cut down to a sentence, how a sentence can be turned into a scandal, how a scandal can be turned into a week of commentary, and how commentary can then be treated as truth simply because enough people repeated it on camera. The audience sat still. Not frozen. Focused. That kind of focus only happens when people realize they're watching more than an argument. They're watching someone explain the system while surviving inside it. Sunny stepped in again, clearly determined not to let the conversation become a broad philosophical takedown of television itself. She pushed for specifics. She referenced the real-world effect of language, how certain groups hear jokes differently depending on history, power, and lived experience. Again, it was a solid point. And again, Dave did something unexpected. He didn't dismiss it. He slowed down. That slowdown was powerful. Because when someone like Chappelle lowers his voice instead of raising it, the room leans in whether it wants to or not. He said there is a difference between discussing pain and assigning ownership of all pain to the nearest visible target. That line landed deep. He explained that people often demand nuance only after they've already flattened someone into a headline. That once a public figure is cast as the villain, every future sentence is filtered through that label. Every joke becomes evidence. Every explanation becomes evasion. Every silence becomes guilt. And in that moment, it became painfully clear that he wasn't just talking about comedy anymore. He was talking about trial by narrative, trial by panel, trial by public reaction. And the irony was impossible to miss. He was saying it while sitting at the table where it was happening. One of the hosts, visibly uncomfortable now, tried to cut in with a lighter comment, maybe to soften the atmosphere, maybe to stop the escalation before it became irreversible. A half joke, a smile, something to reset the tone. It didn't work, because the audience didn't laugh the way they were supposed to. They gave that strange, fractured reaction people give when they know the mood has gone too far to be rescued by humor. That's when Dave leaned forward. Not aggressively, deliberately. And he delivered the kind of line that, in a real viral clip, becomes the turning point. The line people replay, subtitle, slow down, and post with "watch this." He said, "If you want honesty from artists, you have to survive honesty in return." The room went dead silent. Not polite silence. Not awkward silence. That heavy, almost cinematic silence that feels louder than shouting. It was the kind of silence that tells you every person in the room just understood exactly what was said, and exactly who it was aimed at. Joy's face tightened. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for the cameras to catch it. Enough for viewers at home to pause, rewind, and say, "Did you see that?" Because that's what makes moments like this explode online. Not just the words. The faces after the words. The breath after the sentence. The half second where someone realizes they've been hit and can't decide whether to hit back or protect the image. Whoopi finally stepped in more firmly this time. Her role now was obvious: stabilize the room. She tried to broaden the conversation, saying that difficult conversations matter, that people can disagree, that art and accountability are always going to collide in public life. It was a fair attempt. A strong one, actually. And for a brief moment, it looked like the segment might finally regain balance. Dave even nodded. But then he said something that took the whole thing even deeper. He said disagreement is healthy. But public conversation stops being healthy the moment one side gets to define itself as concerned, while the other side is automatically cast as dangerous. That line was brutal, because it cut through the entire structure of modern televised conflict. He was saying the frame itself was rigged, that one side gets to appear moral by default, and the other side is forced to begin from defense, forced to apologize before speaking, forced to justify their existence in the conversation before the conversation has even started. And that is the kind of claim that instantly changes how viewers watch everything that follows. Suddenly, every interruption matters more. Every facial expression matters more. Every attempt to clarify starts to feel like control. And that's exactly what was happening. Joy responded fast this time, almost too fast, because when people feel the narrative slipping, speed becomes a weapon. She said nobody was calling him dangerous. Nobody was trying to silence him. After all, he was sitting right there on national television. And on paper, that's a powerful rebuttal. Maybe the strongest, surface-level rebuttal she had all segment. But Dave's answer is what made the tension nearly unbearable. He gave a tiny smile, looked around the table, looked out at the audience, then back at Joy. And he said, Being invited to speak isn't the same as being invited to be heard. That was the line. The line. If this were a real viral segment, that would be the one people used in headlines. That would be the quote in reaction videos. That would be the caption under every repost. That would be the sentence fans would call the moment he shut the room down. Because it distilled everything. The format. The trap. The performance. The appearance of openness versus the reality of framing. The audience reacted instantly. This time, the applause came faster and louder than before. Not unanimous, but strong. Strong enough that it visibly changed the energy on stage. Strong enough that the hosts had to sit through it. Strong enough that for a few long seconds, nobody at the table could speak over it without looking desperate. And that's what made it so powerful. For the first time in the segment, the applause itself became part of the confrontation. Not just a reaction. A verdict. The producers had to be scrambling now. You could almost imagine the control room. People in headsets whispering. Someone counting seconds. Someone deciding whether to cut early. Someone praying for a commercial break. Because the danger of live television isn't just controversy. It's momentum. Once the audience starts validating the guest more than the panel, the structure begins to collapse. And right there, in front of everyone, that structure was cracking. Joy tried one final push. She said that if Dave believed the conversation was so unfair, why keep coming back to spaces like this at all? Why sit down for the interview? Why agree to the platform? It was meant as a challenge. A logical trap. But Dave's answer didn't just escape it. It transformed it. He said because sometimes the only way to show people how a room works is to sit in it while the walls close in. That sentence hit like a closing bell. Gasps. A few nervous laughs. A longer burst of applause. And complete, undeniable tension across the panel. At that point, the segment had moved beyond uncomfortable. It had become iconic. Because now the viewers weren't just watching a celebrity survive a tough interview. They were watching a man turn the interview itself into the subject. And once that happens, there is no easy way back. By the time Dave Chappelle delivered that last line, the room was no longer pretending. Not the hosts, not the audience, not even the cameras. Because there comes a point in live television when everyone understands that the segment has escaped its format. The smiles stop feeling natural. The transitions stop feeling smooth. And the people trained to control the moment suddenly realize the moment is now controlling them. That's exactly where The View found itself. The applause from the audience faded, but not completely. It didn't end with closure. It ended with pressure. A strange kind of lingering energy that stayed in the room like smoke after something explosive. The hosts sat there, still composed on the surface, still maintaining their posture, their expressions, their television instincts. But underneath it all, the atmosphere was cracked wide open. And Dave knew it. He wasn't grinning. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't doing victory laps. That's what made the scene even more powerful. He looked calm. Still. Almost detached. As if the point had never been to win the argument. As if the point had simply been to expose it. That calmness made everyone else look even more tense. Joy Behar, clearly aware that the conversation had moved into dangerous territory, made one final attempt to pull it back to safer ground. Her voice softened. The edge was still there, but it was wrapped now in the kind of controlled politeness television veterans use when they know the moment has already slipped beyond their control. She said, carefully, that no one on the panel was trying to attack him personally. That they were discussing ideas. That difficult conversations are part of public life. And that, in her view, asking hard questions isn't a trap, it's accountability. On paper, it was the right move. Measured. reasonable. A final attempt to restore balance. But the problem was this. The audience had already seen too much. Once viewers feel the tension beneath the format, once they sense the performance behind the conversation, a clean reset becomes almost impossible. Because even calm words start sounding strategic. Even fairness starts sounding rehearsed. Even accountability starts sounding like branding. And Dave understood that better than anyone in the room. He looked at Joy, paused, then gave an answer that didn't sound like a comeback. It sounded like a closing statement. He said accountability matters. But accountability without self-awareness is just theater. The audience reacted instantly. A wave of gasps. Then applause. Then that familiar split second of chaos where the room doesn't know whether it's watching an interview, an argument, or the end of something much bigger. Joy's expression tightened again. Not outrage. Recognition. Because in that moment, he had done it one more time. He had taken the language of the panel and turned it back on the panel. He wasn't rejecting the idea of accountability. He was questioning who gets to perform it, who gets to weaponize it, who gets to stand above the conversation and decide who is worthy of nuance and who gets reduced to a headline. And that question was too big for the segment, too big for the format, too big for a neat little daytime TV conclusion. Whoopi, seeing exactly how combustible the room had become, stepped in with more force than before. Her tone was warmer, steadier, but firmer. She reminded everyone that strong opinions can coexist, that art is supposed to provoke, and that public figures, hosts included, live in a world where every word is scrutinized. It was probably the smartest attempt at de-escalation all day. For a moment, it almost worked. Almost. Dave nodded. He even gave a brief smile, like he respected the effort. Then he leaned back, looked across the table, and said something that changed the ending of the segment forever. He said, "That's true, but some people get scrutinized, and some people get edited into villains." That line hit the room like cold air. No explosion. No shouting. No interruption. Just impact. Pure impact. Because now the argument wasn't about one interview anymore. It wasn't even about one show. It was about modern media itself. About how stories are packaged. How public figures are simplified. How complexity is punished. How context disappears. And how millions of people often end up debating a version of a person that was constructed for them, cut, framed, and delivered as certainty. The audience didn't erupt immediately this time. They hesitated. That hesitation mattered, because it meant the line had gone deeper than applause. People were thinking. And thinking is more dangerous to television than cheering. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but before she could fully launch into the next sentence, the timing everyone had been dreading finally arrived. The producers moved to commercial. You could almost feel it. That invisible shift. That sudden urgency in the room. The kind of abrupt transition that only happens when the control room decides the safest option is escape. A voice off camera. A rushed cue. A host trying to smile through tension. And just like that, the show began to move toward break. But the problem with moments like this is that commercial breaks don't erase them. They freeze them. They trap them in the minds of viewers at the exact point of maximum tension. And that is why what happened next mattered just as much as everything that came before. As the segment wrapped, the hosts thanked Dave in that careful, practiced tone people use when they need to sound gracious without revealing what just happened. Dave nodded politely. No smug grin. No dramatic exit. No final jab. Just a look. A calm, unreadable look that somehow said more than any final line could have. And then the cameras cut. But the moment didn't. Because the second it hit social media, it exploded. Clips began circulating within minutes. First short clips, then slowed down clips, then watch this moment reposts, then reaction channels, then commentary pages, then stitched breakdowns with captions like, Dave Chappelle, DSTROIS The View Live. Joy Behar left speechless after Dave's response. This was the most uncomfortable moment on daytime TV. The exact second the room lost control. And once the internet gets hold of a moment like that, the narrative multiplies. Some viewers called it a masterclass. They said Dave never shouted, never lost his temper, never played the victim. He simply stayed calm, exposed the frame, and turned the interview into a referendum on media hypocrisy. Others saw it differently. They argued he was deflecting, that he avoided the core criticism, that instead of answering directly, he redirected attention to the hosts and the format. And that split, that disagreement, that was exactly why the clip spread even faster. Because the internet doesn't reward clarity. It rewards conflict. It rewards ambiguity. It rewards moments where both sides feel absolutely certain they just watched the truth. Reaction channels began dissecting every frame. Body language experts suddenly appeared. People zoomed in on Joy's face after specific lines. They replayed the applause. They analyzed the pauses. They debated whether Whoopi was defending the show or quietly trying to save it. Some even claimed the producers cut to commercial early to stop the damage. Whether that was true or not almost didn't matter. Because once people believed they saw a moment of real television break through the polished surface, they become obsessed. That's what the clip represented. Not just celebrity drama. Not just a tense interview. It represented something rarer. A break in the performance. A crack in the machinery. A moment where the audience felt like they were seeing the truth beneath the format. And that is catnip for the internet. By the end of the day, the debate had moved far beyond the view. Commentators were now asking bigger questions. Has public conversation become too performative? Are media platforms genuinely interested in difficult discussions, or only in controlled conflict? Do audiences still trust the people framing the debate? And perhaps the biggest question of all, when a guest refuses the role they've been assigned, is that courage? Or is it simply another kind of performance? Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what made the moment so powerful. Because Dave Chappelle didn't just survive the confrontation. He changed its shape. He walked into a space designed to challenge him, and ended up forcing that space to explain itself. That's rare. Very rare. And whether people admired it or hated it, they remembered it. Because in an era where most televised clashes are loud, chaotic, and instantly forgettable, this one felt different. It was quiet, controlled, precise. No screaming. No meltdown. No thrown insults. Just tension. Just timing. Just carefully aimed sentences, landing one after another until the entire room changed. That's why the silence mattered. Not because nobody had anything to say, but because, for one brief moment, everyone understood exactly what had just happened. The guest had stopped being the subject, and the show itself had become the story. That is the nightmare of live television, and the dream of the internet. By the time the final clips finished spreading, the verdict was already sealed, not by critics, not by hosts, not by headlines, but by the millions of viewers who couldn't stop replaying the moment. Not because they all agreed, because they all felt it. That electric, unmistakable sensation when a polished set suddenly feels unstable. When a carefully managed segment turns into a cultural flashpoint. When the cameras keep rolling long enough for the truth, or at least something that feels like truth, to slip through. And in the end, that's what people remembered most. Not the topic, not the setup, not even the controversy. They remembered the shift. The exact second the room changed. The exact second the hosts stopped leading the conversation. The exact second the audience realized they were no longer watching a guest answer questions. They were watching a guest turn the table. And that is why the moment went viral. Because on that day, for a few unforgettable minutes, The View didn't just host Dave Chappelle. It got challenged by him. And when it was over, the loudest thing left in the room was the silence.